A helicopter crash in California takes the lives of 9 people, but the one everyone's talking about is Kobe Bryant and also his 13-year-old daughter. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, this is an unusual topic for this show. You are a resident of the Los Angeles area and also a pilot. And so I wanted to just ask you, first of all, as an LA guy, what is the impact of losing someone like Kobe Bryant? Give people across the nation a sense of what it's like from where you are.
I'm going to have to go at this question another way. One of the things that I've always prided myself on was, and I've said many times, I said, look, if somebody makes a better case about something and I realize I'm wrong, I'll change my mind. And the reason I want to talk about this is that this is one of those cases, and it happened to me just yesterday. And I think it's interesting in a number of different ways. When my wife and I were having lunch in a sports bar yesterday, needless to say, it was everywhere. It's been everywhere since it happened. It's been all people in LA are talking about. And I saw these people crying in these sort of impromptu monuments and so on that people put out. And I said, I don't understand this. There have been people who've died, like Neil Armstrong, and so on, that I miss and that I feel sad about. But this connection to people, people are just crying everywhere. I just said, I just don't understand it. It reminds me of the Princess Di thing, where people just had this incredibly emotional reaction to somebody they never knew. And I just thought the whole thing was a little unrealistic. Let's put it that way. And then in the course of being there for an hour, I saw interviews with everybody who had ever played with the guy, with all of his coaches, all of his people, not the fans, just his peers, more or less. And I began to realize that I was wrong about this, and I was wrong in the case of Princess Diana too, and that it was a blind spot for me. Kobe Bryant was not just a basketball player. And not just a great basketball player, not just arguably the best ever, but certainly in the pantheon of the top 5 anyway. But watching the interviews and seeing the effect that this had on grown old men who had worked with him for 20 years ago in the past and so on, began to dawn on me that this, because I'm obviously not a basketball fan or a Lakers fan or anything like that, but it began to dawn on me that it was not so much his behavior on the court, which was spectacular, but that it was the quality of the man himself that had touched so many people. And over the course of an hour, I had the simultaneously pleasant and unpleasant feeling and experience of realizing that I'd been very wrong about something. And I'd been wrong about it for rather arrogant reasons, just because nobody that I know in the pop culture has ever upset me to that degree, nor can I imagine it. I had assumed that this whole thing was sort of like an emotional overreaction, oversimplification. I was wrong about that. Kobe Bryant is one of several people, Michael Jackson was another, and Princess Di was another, who inspired people on a fundamental level. And just because they didn't do that to me, or because even the people who I admire who did that more or less for me, Neil Armstrong's the number one example I can think of, because I didn't have that kind of emotional reaction to their passing, I thought that the whole thing was kind of somehow just illegitimate, just a little silly, to be honest with you. And I was dead wrong about that. He clearly had an enormous influence in the lives of not only of his colleagues, but also in the lives of his fans. And he represented something to them. And his loss is felt by them in a way that from the outside appears to be grieving the loss of somebody you never met, but is actually, in fact, grieving the loss of something that represented a light in your life, an inspiration, a goal, comfort, any number of these things and more. And when I was done, I was pretty thoroughly ashamed of myself, and I don't think I'll make that mistake again.
I have a colleague. In my other career, I work selling furniture in a retail store. And one of my colleagues I was talking to yesterday, and he said he was in the middle of working with a customer, straight commission salesperson. This is how he earns his living. And somebody texted him and said that Kobe Bryant had died. And he thought it wasn't true. And he kind of slyly responded while the customer was looking at the furniture. And the guy texted him back with a link to a story. And my friend literally looked at his customer and said, "I'm sorry, I need a moment," and stepped away from the sales presentation and went and read this story and watched whatever video he had been sent about this.
And probably cried.
There is an extent, yes, and there is an extent to which even non-basketball fans have been impacted by this loss. Even my wife, who pays no attention at all to basketball, she was struck on the level of, here is a 41-year-old man who's, coaching kids basketball, and his daughter goes down with him in the helicopter. There are 3 remaining daughters, leaving his wife behind. I mean, there's just so many levels of this tragedy that seem to touch the lives of average Americans that it took me by surprise as well.
One of the things, and I have to tell you, strangely enough, this whole process lasted a little over an hour. And in the course of that hour, I could see on TV corrections being made, because when I started watching, it was the loss of Kobe Bryant, then the loss of Kobe Bryant and his daughter. And somewhere over the course of the hour of all this coverage, somebody else realized, that there were, what was it, total of 9 people on the plane?
Yes.
And then they started listing the names of the other 9 people on the helicopter. And I thought that was the right thing to do. And one thing I noticed was, of the list of the names of the other people on the helicopter. So if you have 2 Bryants on board, there was another family that had 2 people on board and another family that had 3. And sometimes I find it a little unjust for all of this grief for people that are famous, and at the same time, we kind of forget about the people that weren't. But this is the lesson I learned yesterday. Seriously, it is. It's not that people only care about famous people and don't care about non-famous people. It's that the famous people have touched them on some personal level and affected their lives on some personal level. And Kobe Bryant, with teaching girls basketball and all the rest of it, by all accounts, was just one of those figures of light that really just helped a lot of people. And now that he's gone, it's not so much. This is a thought I had very clearly. These people are not crying so much for the loss of Kobe Bryant so much as they're crying for the loss of what Kobe Bryant stood for in their lives, and that is a real tragedy. It also illuminates the power of celebrity. In other words, if you, and I'm not demeaning Kobe or anybody else about this in the slightest, not at all. I'm just trying to put it out there as an observation that is important. If you look at the emotional response to the death of Kobe Bryant, you begin to realize just how much of an effect it has for Kobe Bryant to support, let's say, President Obama over Mitt Romney or anything else. The emotional power of people who are your idols is in many cases overwhelming. And because so many of them are either in sports or formerly in movies, it throws an awful lot of weight, which the only reason I throw this in here really has nothing to do with Kobe at all. Only to say that when we talk about things like Hollywood celebrities, and I mentioned things like the power of Kanye West coming out in favor of Donald Trump, the emotional, physical impact of the death of Kobe Bryant on people gives you some kind of a measure of how much respect and admiration they have for characters like that, and the power that the endorsement of somebody like that can have in terms of just regular politics.
He had a sense of single-minded focus on excellence in whatever he was doing, whether that was on the basketball court or in charitable work or in his business life, or in most recently, in his devotion to his children and being able to work with them. My understanding is, from what I've read, that his use of a helicopter even was just a way for him to minimize the amount of time that he had to spend in California traffic so that he could get from, practice when he's been flying in helicopters for years, to get from practice faster back home. He apparently entered the league, and he was in the league for 20 years, a long time for a point guard, right out of high school. And yet the guy was trilingual. He spoke English, Italian, and Spanish, and I think that's what inspired so many people about him, was a sense of devotion to one's craft. Like, whatever you're doing, do it with excellence, do it to the best of your ability, do it with all your heart. And that, I think, is an example that lifts people up.
Without question. Kobe Bryant was a prodigy. To not have to play college, as you point out, just go directly into the pros, is astonishing. But more than that, everybody has seen examples of showboating and chest thumping, and needless to say, in the course of the time that I've been here in LA, I've seen thousands of 1 or 2 second clips of Kobe Bryant in action, and I've seen Kobe Bryant triumphant, but I've never seen him like showing off. I've never all of the kind of emotional reactions that he's had to big wins or whatever the case may be seemed to me anyway to be exactly what you were pointing at. Like that was difficult to do, and I executed it, and it helped my team. It wasn't the false bravado you often. So it's that line about somebody doing an end zone dance and the referee saying, "Hey kid, why don't you act like you've been here before and expect to come back here someday?" None of that at all in there. And his generosity and so on is important. The thing, the helicopter he was in, eight people. Is a big for helicopter. It's a gigantic helicopter.
Yeah, and let's focus specifically on that for a bit, because you not only are a licensed pilot, but you have actually flown experimental aircraft in California, and the kind of challenges that you have to deal with terrain that radically changes, and breezes coming off the ocean or wind coming off the ocean. What is your insight into what you know so far of the crash circumstances?
I have flown the route that helicopter flew hundreds of times. That's not an exaggeration. Hundreds of times I have flown that route. Last night I got a chance to listen to the air traffic control recordings and also look at the ground radar track of the helicopter. And the track that this guy made was not unusual in terms of trying to go from one place in LA to another. It's complicated with Burbank's airspace, Van Nuys airspace, and so on. But from the beginning, when I heard that it was a helicopter accident in fog, that alone caused me to really question things. As some of the information came out, again, this is all very preliminary, and I don't want to give anybody the impression I'm like a inside story or I have any facts on this. But my understanding was that when the helicopter collided with terrain, it did so very high speed. Somebody said 160 miles an hour, which is very near, if not at the top speed of a twin-engine Sikorsky helicopter. The reason I mentioned the helicopter was big, by the way, is that there were so many other people on board that I have no doubt whatsoever that Kobe Bryant could have had a much less expensive helicopter, but I'm sure he was taking people for the fun of it. He was taking people to be with him, to help enjoy this prosperity and this experience. But back to the flying. It's so personally poignant for me because in the air traffic control recordings, he's talking to Burbank. I've dealt with Burbank many times. And then he gets a transition to cross north of Van Nuys airspace. And I hear the controller on the radio, on this audio recording. And I know that voice so well. It's a woman. She's the most professional, absolutely most professional, kind, and capable air traffic controller I've ever heard. And hearing her voice on that, issuing this clearance across the Van Nuys Class Delta airspace, was so bizarre for me because I've heard that voice giving me the exact same instructions so many times. So anyway, apparently both fields were IFR, Burbank and Van Nuys. That means that the cloud conditions are so low that you have to have an instrument clearance and an instrument rating to depart. But there is a set of rules called special VFR, and special VFR is a case where the pilot is not flying under instruments. He's not flying under ground control, which is required when you're flying IFR, instrument flight rules. And he asked for a special VFR clearance, which is something you do if you feel like you can see visually what you need to see, despite the fact that otherwise you would not be allowed to do this. It is essentially an exemption that says, I understand that technically I should not be flying by visual flight rules now, but I'm here, so I am telling you, in my personal decision, even though the minimums are below what they would be for VFR, they're above what they would be for solid IFR, and I'm telling you I want to take the chance, and I want a special VFR clearance for this particular procedure. And it was issued to him, and it routinely is issued. In fact, it's almost, I can't think of an exception when it wasn't issued.
And this is a verbal issuance? Correct.
So he was basically holding south of Burbank, and Burbank basically said, Burbank is IFR. It's instrument conditions at Burbank Airport. If you don't have an instrument clearance, and you don't, you can't land here without some kind of, you can't just walk in and land here. You're going to have to tell us what you want. You either have to get an instrument clearance or you're going to have to request special VFR or whatever. And the controllers can never, ever, ever, ever recommend special VFR. That was drilled into our heads. They will never, ever recommend it. They're not allowed to. But if a pilot requests it, then it's often given. This is the part about the pilot being in command and responsibility and so on. So both of these accounts said that there was a lot of fog and a lot of low cloud deck. Apparently, this guy was above it. He may have undoubtedly been trying to be below it, and it's what we call scud running, trying to get underneath the weather. And he turned and headed for Calabasas along Las Virgenes Road, which I've flown over hundreds of times, driven hundreds of times. And as he's heading into that direction, Van Nuys hands him off to SoCal Departure, which controls the entire Southern California area. And one of the last calls to the helicopter was saying, sir, you're very low to be operating in that area. And that was it. The thing disappeared from the radar trace. But here's the thing that I find almost impossible to understand, again, sitting here in a comfy chair in complete ignorance of the situation. But there's something, I've got about 25 hours of helicopter instruction. And one of the first things my helicopter instructor told me when I said I was going to go here, I had to go there. Somebody said, you don't have to go anywhere. You're in a helicopter. You can stop anywhere you want to. You can just stop. Unlike an airplane, which has to keep moving at 70, 80, 90 miles an hour minimum, a helicopter can just stop. And a helicopter can not only just stop, a helicopter can land anywhere. I mean, just about anywhere. You can get a helicopter down that's very different than an airplane, especially something like an executive jet or something that's moving much faster, and you have to get to an airport in a case like that. So when I hear that a helicopter pilot hit terrain at a high level of speed, very high speed for a helicopter, I cannot understand the reason for that other than what we call get there-itis. You've got important people on board. I'm not saying Kobe by any means put any pressure on them. I'd be amazed if he had. But the pilot is undoubtedly thinking, okay, look, the weather's not good, but I'm still here. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to check it out. I'll take a look and see. And if it turns out that I can't get over the hill and to the coast, then I'll turn around and come back. This happens all the time. And in the case of most airplane crashes where the airplane flies into terrain, it's called a CFIT accident, controlled flight into terrain. The helicopter is not damaged. He simply flies into a mountain. In almost all the cases, especially in areas like the one in Calabasas, which is a series of canyons and box canyons and so on, it's common for an aircraft trying to run underneath the clouds to fly into what looks like a clear path through, only to find that it is in fact a box canyon. And because he's in an airplane, he doesn't have enough room to turn around, and bam, off he goes. This happens frequently. But again, in a helicopter, I cannot imagine how, and this apparently is the case, but I cannot imagine how, if I was flying a helicopter, I would be flying through conditions where I couldn't see anything at 160 miles an hour. If it were me and I saw that there was nothing out there, no way out of there, then I would turn the helicopter around on a dime, which it'll do, and land it someplace. Or you would think even at the very least you'd move forward at 10 knots or something to give you enough reaction time if it turns out that that the terrain was there. So all I have to say is I don't want to judge this pilot. There could be all kinds of things that I don't know about. But one of the things that we say in aviation regarding accidents is that there are two kinds of airplane accidents. And one of them is the kind where you show up at the pearly gates and St. Peter says, "Hey, tough break, kid." And the other one is where you show up at the pearly gates and St. Peter says, "What the hell were you thinking?" And the tough break kids ones are the ones where a rotor flies off the helicopter or some act of God happens that you just had no control over. And it's difficult for me. I don't want to cast aspersion on this pilot, certainly with his family grieving and all the rest of it. But just speaking strictly as a pilot, it's hard for me to understand that. And for those of you who may think this is kind of harsh, one of the things that many pilots do, most pilots, certainly I do, is that we have almost an obsessive interest in aviation accidents, especially fatal accidents. We don't avoid these things. Most of us want to know everything we possibly can. I had a flight instructor tell me when I was just learning how to fly, he said, "You better learn from the mistakes of others, kid, because you're not going to live long enough to make them all yourself." And so you look at these things and you start asking yourself as a pilot, what did this guy do that I wouldn't have done? And you like to tell yourself that you would have stopped here, or you would have done this, or you would have done that. But I've also had felt the pressure of having to be someplace and promising to be someplace. That's certainly what killed John F. Kennedy Jr. And it seems to be unlike a mechanical crash. It seems to me that just looking at the radar trace and hearing the air traffic control, I have a hard time understanding why the pilot took the actions that he did.
Well, there will literally be a federal investigation of this in the coming days, and that happens after every aircraft accident, especially because of the prominence of this. It'll be more public than the average one, and so we'll be watching that with interest, mourning along with the family and the many fans and people, frankly, who were just impacted by Kobe Bryant, who weren't even basketball fans. So our thoughts and prayers are with those folks. We're grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com who've enabled us to have serious conversations like this. And if you'd like to join them, you can go to BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thank you.